This episode of the HVAC School podcast is made possible by Danfoss. You probably have worked with many Danfoss parts over the years, but Danfoss makes compressors, valves, controls, variable frequency drives, a whole range of different products for the HVACR and controls industries. And they're the ones making this particular episode possible, and it was actually their idea, even the content of the episode. So big thanks to Danfoss for making this episode possible. Danfoss. Engineering tomorrow, today.
And now the man wanted in 43 states for possession of PVC glue with intent to huff. Brian Orr.
All right, this is the HVAC School Podcast, and I am Brian. This is the podcast that helps you remember some things that you might have forgotten along the way, as well as remember some things that you forgot to know in the first place. And today we're talking to those of you who are early in your career, or maybe even haven't even started in the HVAC business. So we get a lot of questions about HVAC school, trade education, that sort of thing, what the optimum system is, how to find a school. And so rather than me talking about it from my perspective, which I do, and I do give my perspective in this podcast, I wanted to talk to a couple people who have just recently come out of a trade education and get a little bit of their perspective on what it was like and maybe some tips that they have for those of you who are considering it. All right, so here we go. This podcast is all about best practices for HVAC education. I found two techs willing to come on the podcast. One from Texas.
Name's Blake Moody out of Southeast Texas here, Houston area.
And another from Illinois.
My name's Jeremy Arnold. I'm actually in Belleville, Illinois, which is about 25 minutes from St. Louis, Missouri.
Both of them from pretty different marketplaces, different mixes of the type of work that they do, and a lot of different experiences before they got into HVAC school.
Actually, I was welding for 15 years beforehand, and I got out of the welding field and started doing some research, and HVAC was always something that interested me, I guess, and went to school. For the first couple of months, I wasn't working. I would say about the second semester is when they had companies come in and talk with some of the students that were top of the class, and I was one of the ones that got picked, and the instructors and the job would work with us on getting the school finished and sort of working part-time. And once you got out, that's when they would do like a full interview and let you come on full-time. So that's what I did.
My parents tried to get me to go whenever I graduated out of high school, but at that time I was more interested in partying and chasing women, so I didn't listen to them. It took working a bunch of crappy jobs for about 10 years, and finally I just had enough and decided to go back to school. And I've always been mechanically inclined and went to school and did it. I've been happy ever since.
I asked both of them what their general experience of trade school was.
I don't want to talk bad upon the schooling. I mean, school is definitely has gotten me a leg up out here in the field. Was it what I expected? No. It was more when you asked the question, you got the answer. Well, it's in the book, which I can see them doing that to help you out, go figure it out. That's the only way you're going to learn. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it's like, come on, do a little one-on-one with me or show the whole class or whatever you have to do. And it got to the point to where in the last semester, I almost quit and just went out and started working. But I decided not to do that. I didn't think that was going to be the best thing. It definitely helped me where I am now because there's a lot of things that I'm doing that these techs are out here that they've never seen before and that they never heard of, especially with like the theory of HVAC and all that. You can explain things a little bit better, I guess.
I graduated in December of 2017, so I'm basically 8 months out of school.
How long were you in school?
You know what? It was a 2-year program that I did in a year and a half. But I took as many classes as I could and wanted to get it done as fast as I could.
Was it a certificate, or what did you come out with?
They offered a certificate and a degree, but from my research, a degree didn't pay any more than a certificate did, so I just went ahead and did the certificate. That way I could get out in the field quicker.
Many techs who are going to go into trade school or who are just finishing up and getting out may want to know what's different between the field and what it's like in trade school.
It's definitely hotter than the classroom. Definitely hotter than what you think. In our classroom, we were fortunate to be brazing on these sort of tables that were 4 feet off the ground. You had air conditioning on your back. if the floor wasn't covered in sawdust and insulation. And you get out there, and some of these homes weren't made to have ACs in them, but they shoved them up in there, and you have 2 feet of space that you have to crawl into and lay on your back, and the joint is 5 inches from the floor. So it's definitely a little bit different when you get out there, and you'll realize it real fast.
You know what? It is way different because, like I said, initially school was very good. It's good for teaching the basics, the cycles, and getting the terms under your belt. But towards the end of school, I really wasn't learning too much, but I think that was due to the instructors. But in the field for me was kind of no training. I rode around with somebody for a week learning how to do cleaning checkups for summertime, and then they just threw me out there by myself. It was kind of like a baptism in fire. It's not the way I wanted it to go, but I've learned a lot. I haven't really messed anything up yet, but I'm still learning definitely every day.
If you could formulate, so being so close to school, I'm going to ask this question. I don't think I've ever asked anybody this question before, but I'm going to ask you. If you could create an ideal training program that you didn't have the constraints of the field versus school versus whatever, but you could set up the ideal situation for learning that included all the different elements, what would that look like?
In my opinion, the best thing that I could do is definitely do bookwork. Everybody says you don't need bookwork, but I disagree. That's where you get the theory from. If you can read about it and then get hands-on knowledge and almost have like an apprenticeship type thing, in my opinion, that's the best way to go. And it don't have to be union or non-union or anything like that. It's just an apprenticeship where you can ride around with somebody who knows the trade pretty well, get your hands on that way, and you got somebody there that can explain it to you.
Yeah, it makes it a little bit, I mean, I hate to use millennial lingo here, but it makes it a little bit safer when you got somebody looking over your shoulder who can tell you, don't do that, is kind of a thing, but you still get that hands-on experience. I mean, that's the way I was trained. I went to school for about a year. And then when I went into the field, I rode around with people for, 4 months, something like that, 4 or 5 months, and some really good techs. They weren't perfect. They didn't always have the best practices, but they had a good sense of the trade. And I picked up a lot of that practical knowledge from them, because if I would have been stuck into a truck right after I came out of school, I would have screwed up a lot of stuff. I know it, because there's so many things I didn't know coming out of school, even though I had the theory and I was strong on that side of it. Just very practical stuff. I remember when I first got into a truck and we're riding around and he says, "Do you have a 5/16 nut driver?" I said, I know what 5/16 is, but why would I have a 5/16 nut driver? And he's like, well, because that's what all the panels come off with. I'm like, I didn't know there was a standard size. I figured every time you had to take a panel off, you had to go digging through your socket set or something. I didn't realize there was a 5/16 and 1/4 inch. And then he said, well, do you have a 6-in-1 screwdriver? I'm like, what's a 6-in-1 screwdriver? And he grabs my screwdriver out of my hand and he pulls it apart and flips it around. I'm like, I didn't even know it did that. Of course, I was kind of a dumb kid. I was only 17 at the time. But there's a lot of little things like that, and that's an extreme example. But there's tons and tons of little things, like how to pull out a blower housing without taking out more screws than you have to, or how to do a good maintenance on a furnace, depending on the type of furnace that it is. And there's a lot of little things like that that are hard to teach in the classroom.
Right. And you know what? I've had to figure out a lot of that stuff on my own, but I'll be honest with you, there's techs that are at my job that have been doing it for years and still aren't doing things, in my opinion, the proper way whenever they vacuum down a soot. For instance, we just changed a TXV, and they didn't have a micron gauge or anything on. They just vacuumed it for 30 minutes, and they called it good, which is something I disagree with.
That's something that I think is an example of one of the common ones. So you've got the 30-minute vacuum, 1.5 smokes or 2 smokes, whatever, worth of a vacuum, or the not flowing nitrogen while brazing is an example of a really common one. There's a bunch of little ones like that technicians just don't practice regularly. And I think there's a side of it. So how would you advise a technician who's coming out of school, who's maybe learned all these, I'm doing air quotes here, the right way of doing things, who end up in a company where it's not necessarily done that way? How do you go about having those conversations, or maybe not having them in a way that doesn't cause you to be ostracized?
I base it off the person. Some people go into this trade because they think, oh, I'm going to make decent money at it, so that's what I'm going to do. But there's other people who are really into it, like really nerdy about it, where that's kind of where I fit, where I never stop learning. I'm constantly reading. I'm always listening to your podcast or reading research or constantly learning. That way I can be a better technician. If you're just learning from somebody at the company, you're only going to be as best of a technician as the worst one there. Whereas I strive to have perfection, so to say. And I'm not saying that I'll become perfect, but I never stop learning and trying to advance and learn better methods and ways.
Right. So what you're saying is that if you have somebody who's more that way, then maybe you could bring it up to them. But if it's your average technician, I shouldn't say average, but like a lot of techs are, where they really don't care, they're just doing it to collect a paycheck, maybe it's not worth wasting your breath on it then.
Right. Or, the technician that's, I've been doing it for 30 years and I've always been fine. And I got one of those. He's a great guy, but he's kind of set in his ways. Another thing that surprises me is a lot of techs don't do subcooling and a superheating reading unless they're charging a system. They don't gather all that data to make a diagnosis on a system. They think that it's only for charging something.
Yeah, there's a lot of different things like that. And that's where sometimes even techs get confused because I don't know if you listen to the podcast where Jim and I talk about checking the charge without gauges. And a lot of techs think that means that you're taking fewer readings when in fact doing it that way actually requires a deeper knowledge of the equipment to do it properly. It's not just doing beer can cold. It's far from that. It's actually extending the knowledge that you have in order to be less invasive in the equipment. So there's all kinds of things like that out there that once you start to get more and more familiarized with the equipment and familiarized with your readings, that you get even better and better as a technician as you go. So it's tough sometimes because I was the same way. When you have all this stuff that you want to practice in the field and then you're working at a place where they're not bad people. I mean, obviously there are some bad people out there, but I want to state that just because somebody doesn't do things by the book doesn't make them a bad person, but it does mean that they're maybe not providing the service that their customers are hoping that they will, which is something that I think a lot of us are uncomfortable with. I know I certainly am.
Right. Well, that's the same way with like the vacuuming down the system. Unless I know I can get it down to a 500 micron vacuum, then I'm not comfortable pumping the system back up and leaving, because I've seen it where they've done their 30-minute vacuum checks and then their pressures were off and they left. To me, that I'm not comfortable with that. I don't want to leave unless it's working as close to perfect as I can get it.
Now, I've done a video on this, and you can go back and look it up by just typing in ERC 213 on YouTube on our channel. But I did a video of using the Danfoss universal control for a couple different things. But in the video that I show, primarily I'm showing it installed in a reach-in freezer, and I kind of show how you can set it up and how versatile it is. And we've been really happy with the ERC 213. It's made by Danfoss. It is a universal refrigeration control that can be used for low temp or medium temp refrigeration. You have a lot of different options with how you do defrost, a lot of different options with the sensors, and it's just a really nice kind of all-around quality digital control that can be used for technicians out there. It's a good one to keep on your truck if you run into, say, an old electromechanical control that's having issues or you need that little additional level of control. It's the standard size that slides into most common reach-ins and even walk-in type applications, and it's just a nice all-around control. That is the ERC 213 from Danfoss, and you can find it at most of your quality refrigeration supply houses near you. All right, here we go. Back to the podcast. So I asked both of them what were some of their top tips for going into trade school in the first place.
It's funny that you say that because I was fortunate to be working while going to school. I already knew about this, especially with the brazing thing. I'm big on that. If you can, as much as you can, take that braze joint, and if you possibly can get it 3 or 4, 5, 6 inches off the floor, try brazing it off the floor. Definitely. Taking it outside in the heat. Get used to stuffy situations for sure where there's not a lot of ventilation. It's definitely hot up there, but hotter than the classroom for sure.
What about tools-wise? So how did you make that transition? Because when you go from working in the classroom to the field, a lot of guys acquiring the right tools. Did you do it all at once? Did your employer provide it, or have you done it piecemeal? How did you go about that?
I was talking to an old technician, and he told me every time you get paid, spend some money on a tool. And I started doing that after I got the job, and eventually when I got out of school, I had pretty much everything I even needed, even down to digital gauges, the S-Mens. And that technique worked out for me pretty well. Of course, pay your bills and all that stuff, but if you can, try to buy a tool from $20 to $50 every week or every time you get paid, and you'll eventually get it. At the school I was at, they had a tool loaner program, and you could actually keep the tools for up to 6 months or something like that after you got out. I didn't qualify for that program, but certain schools may have it, some may don't. If you qualify, definitely take advantage of something like that because they can. I know the one I went to, you had to have every single tool by the second semester, and it was well over $2,000.
Well, no, it's a big investment. I mean, tools are.
It is. It definitely is. It definitely is.
I would say that it's not just something you go to school for and you learn and you're done and then you get a job. To me, it's a lifelong career of constantly learning. It's the trade with homework is how I like to say it, because you'll never quit learning. You're always going to learn and find out something new, and the technology constantly outruns faster than you can learn it. As soon as you learn something, then they come up with something new, and then you got to relearn something.
Which is an advantage if you're kind of nerdy and like learning new things, but it can be frustrating if you're not into that kind of thing.
When I was in school, we never went over any of the DC stuff. And then when I got out into the field, I got thrown out into, we're primarily Linux type brand, but there's lots of DC Linux out there. I've had to come home and research that myself because I'm by myself. I don't have somebody out there to, what is this right here? What does this do? So I take pictures of it, and then I come home and I'll Google manuals or look it up until I can find the answer that I'm looking for.
Yep. Or, hey, if you get really stuck, you can always post it in the HVAC School Facebook group and have us beat you up about it.
Right. Hey, I'll take any kind of knowledge I can get. I never stop. I constantly like to learn. Back to your one question, that's kind of what makes it good or a successful day to me, is if you're learning something. Then you feel like you accomplished something.
So I asked Jeremy and Blake if they would do anything differently if they had to do their trade education all over again.
Actually, yes, there would be. When I first started out working and going to school, on the working side, not school-wide, but in the field, I would have been more assertive with the senior techs. There was a lot of times where I really wanted to put my hands on things, and I know I could have done it, and they were telling me, no, let me do it, just watch. I would definitely be more assertive, saying, no, I'm out here, I'm trying to learn this stuff. I have to grasp it, and definitely get your hands on your tools and the equipment as much as possible. Don't be scared of the electrical side of it. Just respect it. Don't be scared of it. Not too much. Be scared of it, but not a lot.
Well, I wish I would have started whenever I got out of high school, when my parents suggested it back in 2004. I'd have done it earlier. The only other thing I would have tried to do is find an apprenticeship, but it seems like almost now to get an apprenticeship, you almost have to go to school to show that you're serious about it. You got a better chance of getting an apprenticeship if you got like a certificate or some sort of schooling under your belt or experience. My best advice would be is try to get somebody to apprentice with you.
Yeah, I think you've got it right, though, is that a combination of really three things makes for an ideal education. First thing, before you even get into the three, is you've got to have a person who wants to learn. So if you don't want to learn, then you're not going to learn. This isn't the type of trade that's going to be spoon-fed to you. And I think a lot of people, especially my generation and younger, were maybe expecting education to be spoon-fed, and that's just not how our trade works. Then find a good school, find a place that you're going to get a good, solid trade education, but then look for an apprenticeship. I think we definitely need an increase in apprenticeship in this country, where they do this in Canada, and I think it's a really great practice where you have kind of an established process where you go through and you learn things, and then you go back into the class, and then you go back into the field and you learn some more and you apply it and you go back to the class, and it's kind of a consistent back and forth. And I think in a lot of places you can find that. At Kalos, we're happy to do that sort of thing with people at my company. And then, sorry, that sounded like an ad. I didn't mean it to, but it's just a good practice. It's just a great way to develop people. And then finally, always be looking for things to supplement your education. And that can be within your organization. That can be reading books, like a refrigeration air conditioning technology manual, or Dick Wer's book, Commercial Refrigeration for Air Conditioning Techs. Those are a couple of good ones. But in addition to that, online, listening to podcasts, watching videos, there's getting to be more and more really good education out there, as long as you're able to find the ones that are good and not the ones that teach you the wrong way.
Right.
But if you have those three, the formal education, the apprenticeship style where you get your hands on, and then using your resources, manufacturers put out a lot of really great stuff as well. And I think that makes for a pretty rounded tech, and you don't necessarily have to take as long as maybe some people think it does. It still takes a couple years to get through it all, but I think you end up having pretty good earning potential and a really good career if you follow those tips. What do you think?
I agree, absolutely. I mean, you're only going to be as good as a tech as you allow yourself to become. If you're just doing it as a job, then you're never going to become a top tech. Definitely, the more education you have and the more stuff you know, the more money you're going to make, the better tech you're going to be.
Hey, thanks for listening to this podcast. I know it was different. This was sort of a special episode. And like I said, the idea for this episode came from Dan Foss, and I appreciate it. I think it's a good topic, especially for those looking to get into the trade. And it's nice to get these questions answered. I think the result of this is that if you want to learn something, you really want to learn it, then you will. And using schooling, using field education, apprenticeship, and then finding other resources to help answer questions that you have along the way, that's how you do it. And you don't get there overnight. This is not a simple trade by any stretch of the imagination, so it's going to take you some time. Everybody has an opinion about how much time that should take, but it really depends on the person, obviously. Some people pick things up a little quicker than others. It was always easy for me to understand the theory, but it took me a little while to get the practice down. I'm not good at math and measuring things and making it all line up in angles and those sorts of things. It's never been natural to me. So when I was doing change-outs early in the business, I didn't always get it right the first time, and people would laugh at me. But I think we all have our different strengths and weaknesses, so some things will come quickly and some will take longer, and it's going to vary person to person. But I think it's a great trade. I would encourage you to get into it, and if you do, have a love of learning, definitely get the theory and the book stuff and look for a good quality trade education. Look for an apprenticeship, if possible, with a good quality company that's going to teach you to do it the right way and actually require that you do it the right way. And then also find some resources that will help you along the way, like hopefully HVAC School is for you. All right, that's all for now. As always, you can find more trade-oriented podcasts by going to bluecollarroots.com. We've got quite a few over there that you can check out. You can also listen to the HVAC School podcast right on our website at hvacrschool.com. You know that obviously I had a baby recently, and that's gone really well. She's really healthy. But last time I went to the doctor for myself, I had a really wrinkly shirt on. And when I walked into the doctor, he said, "Well, clearly you have an iron deficiency." That joke was not funny. All right, thanks for listening. We will talk to you next time on the HVAC School Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the HVAC School Podcast. You can find more great HVACR education material and subscribe to our short daily tech tips by going to hvacrschool.com. If you enjoy the podcast, would you mind hopping on iTunes or the podcast app and leave us a review? We would really appreciate it. See you next week on the HVAC School Podcast.